Hello, my name is Dinara, and this session is on using the target language and providing comprehensible input. Let's start the session by taking a look at the STARTALK-endorsed Principles for effective teaching and learning and characteristics of effective language lessons. STARTALK identifies 6 principles. In this session, we will focus on the principle using the target language and providing comprehensible input for language instruction. However, you will notice that as you are learning more about target language use and comprehensible input, you are touching upon other key STARTALK principles. Let's dive deeper into this principle. Using the target language and providing comprehensible input for instruction means that the teacher uses the target language at least 90% of the time. The teacher uses a variety of strategies to make language comprehensible, monitors student comprehension, and makes adjustments as necessary. The teacher avoids the use of translation by using verbal and nonverbal strategies and also avoids eliciting translation from students. Now that we have identified the characteristics of the STARTALK principle, let's see what TELL project says about effective target language use and comprehensible input. First of all, let's talk about TELL. What is TELL? TELL project is the Teacher Effectiveness for Language Learning project. TELL identifies 7 domains and specific criteria for what effective language learning looks like. In this session, we will focus on the following domains: planning and learning experience. Under the planning domain, the focus question is, how does my planning of learning experiences prepare for student learning? And specific criteria is, I plan lessons containing activities that are contextualized, connect to prior learning, and require attention to planning. Under this specific criteria, we have several points. It's planning how you will explain and introduce activities as well as concepts only using the target language. Planning to minimize the use of English language by carefully and deliberately determining when and if the English language should be used. And planning activities that provide students with comprehensible input. Under the learning experience, the focus question is, how do I provide meaningful learning experiences that advance student learning? And specific criteria is, I ensure that students receive comprehensible input. Several points under this specific criteria are ensuring that at least 90% of what is said and materials that are being shared with the students are in the target language, minimizing the use of English by carefully and deliberately determining when and if the English language should be used, using a variety of strategies to making the language comprehensible, and clarifying what is being said in a variety of ways. This is what you will be able to do by the end of the session. You will be able to tell what comprehensible input is. You will be able to tell why comprehensible input and target language are important in a word language class. You will be able to tell how to deliver effective comprehensible input in the target language. And you will be able to apply strategies for comprehensible input and target language use in the classroom. By the end of the session, we're also going to take a look at some of the sample strategies and activities to be used in the classroom. In this session, we will be talking about what comprehensible input and target language are, what it means to speak target language, and why is it important, as well as how to make the language comprehensible to the students. So, what do the terms comprehensible input and target language mean? Target language is the language that is being taught compared to the student's native language. We have already identified that effective teachers stay 90% or more of the classroom time teaching in the target language that students are learning. It is not only important to make sure that we as teachers stay in the target language while we're teaching, but also making sure that students are understanding the language and the information that is coming at them. And that is comprehensible input. The first step in language learning is to be able to interpret, to understand the language that is being communicated to you, and being able to make a connection with a word, phrase, or sentence and attach the meaning to it. When I first get a new group of students in the beginning of the year or in the beginning of the semester, and I'm first starting to speak Russian to them, I'm not speaking any English, and my students at first think that they would not be able to understand anything that I'm telling them. But I just love seeing their faces and how they light up as they unconsciously yell out in English, "Oh, she's talking about this. Oh, she's saying so and so." So let's take a second and take a look at how does the brain work. How does it learn? What important scientific findings help us understand about language comprehension and language learning? According to research, language acquisition is effective when input is meaningful and interesting to the students. Real-life application and interest of students is what makes language comprehensible. For example, a way to do that would be getting to know your students and providing them with a language that they're using in real life. For example, to describe themselves. Or another example would be talking about things they like to do. One of the activities for the beginning of the year for me is asking students to use post-it notes to write or draw the things that they like to do, and later on including these things into the target vocabulary. According to David Sousa, information is most likely to get stored if it makes sense and has meaning. If we ask ourselves two questions, is the meaning present? And is the sense present? If we answer yes to both of these questions, then it means that students will have the opportunity to comprehend it at a very high level. Now that we have discussed what comprehensible input is, how the brain learns, and what makes the input comprehensible, let's talk about comprehensible input and target language use and how it connects to proficiency. Research indicates that effective language instruction must provide significant levels of meaningful communication and interactive feedback in the target language in order for students to develop language and cultural proficiency. ACTFL, or American Council on Teaching of Foreign Languages, recommends that language educators and their students use the target language 90% of the time at all levels of instruction during instructional time and, when feasible, beyond the classroom. In classrooms that feature maximum target language use, instructors use a variety of strategies to facilitate comprehension and support meaning making. So it is important not only to provide them with opportunities to communicate in the target language, but also to have a variety of strategies to facilitate the understanding and as well as to support the meaning making. When we are talking about language proficiency, it is important to take a look at the three modes of communication: interpretive, presentational, and interpersonal. When students are interpreting or trying to understand that information that's coming at them, it can be through them listening or reading. Presentational is when students are presenting the information. They might be speaking it or they might be writing it. And interpersonal involves a two-way communication where the students are listening and responding or asking questions and interacting with another person, having conversation with them. Before the students are expected to produce the language, to be able to speak on their own, it is important to give the time to process the language at first, to make sure that they understand it, make sure that they comprehend it. And as teachers, we need to make sure that we're giving those students the opportunity to do so. If they're starting to interpret the language, they're identifying, they're recognizing, they're understanding things. And then later on, that can translate into them being able to use the language by presenting or having a conversation with someone. The step of interpretation, identifying, recognizing, and understanding is very important because it will ultimately lead them to being able to engage in conversations. They will be able to move from having receptive language to producing the language themselves. They will be moving from the input that they're receiving to outputting the language that they're learning. Now that you are starting to get in there and start using the target language in the classroom, what do? First, you need to set up the stage. Setting up the stage involves, firstly, aligning what you're teaching with the learning targets, getting the students to be comfortable with uncomfortable. That's the term that I use a lot in my own classroom. I really want to make sure that students are learning to interpret the information and understanding that it's okay not to understand every single word, and that the more they learn, the more they will understand. However, it is very important that you as a teacher establish the routines. It's important that students are not just listening to you, but also that they're looking at you and that they are engaging in good language learning habits, and as well as repeating what you're saying and speaking the target language themselves. The use of the target language sign in my classroom has really helped me to stay in the target language myself, as well as to remind my students to stay in the target language. I use an actual sign, and when the Russian sign is on, my students or me are not allowed to speak in the English language. Some of the teachers also use a magic bracelet or some other form of regalia to help switch from one language to another. Another important thing is being dramatic and animated. I really believe that making it a fun experience goes a long way. So how do we deliver effective comprehensible input? Well, first of all, it requires a lot of planning. We really, as teachers, need to make sure that we're planning out exactly how we want the lesson to go. We need to make sure we're carefully choosing or creating the resources, making sure that we have a variety of resources and variety of activities and strategies that our students are engaged in. It is not only the spoken language, but it's also the printed text. So sometimes it will involve us displaying things on the screen or printing things out for them so that they can engage with the language in multiple ways. So the important question comes, how do we make sure that the language we're giving them is comprehensible? How do we make sure that the language we're giving them they can understand? How do we make sure they can do that without a translation? How do I, as a teacher, make sure that my students are understanding the content, what it means, and what I'm trying to convey to them? Firstly, you're going to start with the resources. And part of the planning process is identifying whether you have the resources that you could possibly use or whether you need to create your resources. Once you have identified whether you're going to create the resources or find the resources, it's important to make sure that you are incorporating the non-verbal strategies into those resources as you are delivering the comprehensible input. Some of the strategies that you can use in order to make sure that the students are getting multiple opportunities to attach the meaning to the language and form their own understanding of what being said or used is using such things as photographs, visuals, pictures, gestures, facial expressions, manipulative such as cards with pictures, some kind of a realia, or any kinds of props. When you do that, an important part is keeping in mind what students are really into, what their interests are, as well as what their levels are. So you might find that the resource that you have found might be at a higher level. And it doesn't mean that it's not usable. It just means that you need to work with the resource, adjusting it, working with the language complexity, identifying the language structures that you want them to learn and target for that specific lesson, as well as making sure that you are not overwhelming your students, making sure that you are releasing that information to them gradually. When I teach, I really would want to make sure that I'm making a personal connection with my students. I encourage them to open up to me and share their experiences and share their life with me, so that the situations we're talking about are real life situations. I also make sure that I tell them about myself and about my life, my experiences, and my background. Sometimes, when introducing the new language, I will show them the pictures of my own family, of my own experiences, or my friends. Let's take a look at some of these examples. Over here you see the pictures of my parents. I have used these pictures before to talk about my own family. You can use your personal family photos to introduce your family members. You can also use family photos when you're talking about what family members like to do. In these pictures, my parents are dancing and they're taking a picture in Georgia where they traveled to. So when I talked to my students about the things my parents like to do, I have used these pictures. Here's another example of how I have used my own personal photos. For example, describing a friend. My students have learned how to say how old someone is, and where they're from, and where they live, and what they look like. And then later on, they were learning how to describe someone. Students already learned the descriptions, and now they needed a way to apply those descriptions to another person. So I have created a story with my own personal friend, and I use this story to introduce the friend. And you will see the language that I used below the example. Using visuals is very important because then that creates that immediate meaning that students can relate to. I use visuals on a daily basis. This is just one of the examples of how I used the images talking about the weather. I needed a specific image to talk about the types of weather. For example, sun, clouds. And then I also needed my students to be able to understand the difference between the sun and the sunny weather. So I used the pictures of different types of weather to help explain the difference between those concepts and to introduce the language sentence. Here's another example. In this example, I have used visuals of the same objects in different colors. This was an owl, and I was introducing different colors to the students. And they could see the same exact object, in this case an animal, the owl, but in different colors. Here's an example of using the videos or the pictures as well as the recipes of the traditional foods from the target language. These videos or pictures can be teacher created, or you can use the ones that you have found online using authentic resources if that works for you as far as the structure is concerned and if that makes the language comprehensible. Again, below you will be able to see the language used for the specific example. Here's another example of how I have created my own video of me taking a tour around my house. I have recorded this video in order to give my students the opportunity to understand the information that I am presenting to them about the house, the rooms in the house, as well as the furniture. You can also use props and realia. So if you are talking about the food, you can bring the actual pieces of food into your classroom, or you can bring the plastic food, and as you're introducing the language, you can use those props and realia. Same way as far as the animals. You can use the stuffed toys of the animals that you're teaching them. If your students are learning about animals, that's another thing that you can use. So those were the examples of some of the nonverbal strategies that you can use when delivering comprehensible input. Let's talk about some of the verbal strategies when delivering comprehensible input. First of all, it's important to make sure that we're slowing down our speech. Especially if the students are at a novice level, we want to make sure that they are understanding what we're saying, that they are not being frustrated with us because we're speaking too fast, or they're getting overwhelmed because it is so much information coming at them. Paraphrasing new words and sentences. For example, if you're teaching something that someone loves to do in Russian language, I will paraphrase it. I really, really like to do something. I love to do this. Or try to find words and cognates to paraphrase it so that the students can understand it. Giving examples in the target language when introducing new vocabulary compared to translations. So giving examples of a lot of different things. For example, when I introduce the word to play, I will add playing on a guitar and show an image of someone playing on a guitar, and playing on the piano, and playing football, and playing soccer, finding a lot of different ways to introduce that vocabulary. Repetition patterns are very important as well, because students need to hear it so many times before they can output it. Language spiraling. It really depends on the curriculum that you're teaching, and just to make sure that you're reusing the language that you have previously taught and building upon it. Your tone of voice, the intonation, is also very important. Sometimes when you're presenting something, if you are more dramatic or if your tone gets more emotional during certain parts of the sentence or a paragraph, then it will most likely to catch student attention. Here are some of the examples of the resources, such as PowerPoints, teacher-created stories, cultural stories, children's books, magazines or newspapers, advertisements, videos, teacher-created videos, blogs, cartoons, Gwyn series. When implementing these resources, it's important to keep in mind those verbal and nonverbal strategies that we have discussed. Let's take a look at one of the resources that I have created and have used in my classroom. This is an example of the cultural Russian folktale Kolobok. Even though the story of the color book already uses the language similar to what I would love my students to be able to say. I wanted to make sure that my students were not overwhelmed, so I tried to paraphrase as well as use repetition patterns. The language was simplified. I adapted the language to fit the needs of the curriculum. When delivering the story to the students, I made sure that each slide was projected on the screen as I was telling the story slide by slide. I was not just telling the story, but also using the visuals, using the stuffed toys and the prompts, and also using my tone of voice and repetition patterns. I made sure that I was animated. I made sure that I used my hands and gesture things. I also made sure that my speech was also emotional and different depending on what character was talking. Here's another sample activity. Let's take a look closely at what is the learning target for the day, what kind of language we're working with, and what are some of the strategies that we can use when delivering this information. For example, the learning target for this activity is I can identify different clothing items. So in order to make the language comprehensible, I brought in the suitcase with clothes. When I was introducing the language, I was pulling the different clothes out of the suitcase so that the students could make a connection with the actual clothing item. The student's favorite cartoon character likes to travel, and she's taking a trip. Let's see what she has in her suitcase. That's one way of how you can use this activity, presenting it to the students. This is an activity that I have used in elementary school, and my students absolutely enjoyed it because they truly believed that the luggage that I had with me was the one from the favorite cartoon character of theirs. Here is another activity. The learning target is I can tell you who I want to be when I grow up and why. In order to make the language comprehensible, I use the clippings from famous cartoons of characters doing different things. For example, singing, dancing, and cooking, and also added in the sentence structures. I want to be a cook when I grow up. I want to be a doctor when I grow up. And I actually took it a little bit further because my students already know how to say who they wanted to be. I wanted to make sure that I added in the reasons why. I want to be a cook because I like to cook. I want to be a doctor because I like to treat people. If you have some ideas that you have used with your students before, you can also take those ideas or take those resources that you have and you can expand them. For example, first I introduce the animals, then I do the folk tale with the animals. Then I can talk about where the animals live. The animals live in the forest, but where do the pets live? Where does a cat live and a dog live? They live in a house. Or where do other animals live? Maybe they live in the zoo. Then, if you are in elementary school and you would like to have a little bit more fun with your students, you can talk about how those animals from the folk tale, how they come to school. You can take pictures of them in different rooms in the school. You can also talk about what subjects they like. So if you have a creative idea that you have or a resource that you have, you can actually continue to build on it and expand on it, and that will keep the students' interest as well. Here are some of the tips that you need to keep in mind when implementing comprehensible input and speaking in the target language. First of all, it's important to be careful choosing visuals, because as teachers, we want to make sure that we are avoiding confusion. we need to ask ourselves a question. Would we ourselves understand it if we were learning another language? Is that clear enough? Also, it is important to use multiple visuals. We need to make sure that we are helping to create the true meaning and opportunity for students, not only to understand it, but also to react to it in a natural way. Collaborating is very important. Seeing how other teachers using nonverbal and verbal strategies and resources to convey a message. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the teachers of the same language you're teaching. It can be the teachers of a different language. I think we have so much to learn from each other. Be sure to use physical objects and realia when appropriate. I have noticed that when I do use physical realia of physical objects, my students are so much more engaged. Gauging it carefully. Comprehension is at a higher level compared to language production. So it is okay to push them at a higher level because ultimately we want them to produce at a higher level. It's important to make sure that we're providing differentiation of learning styles and levels. Again, having the print materials and then having the pictures and having the realia and having the students listening to us. So just a variety of ways for them to interact with the content. It's important for us as teachers to keep in mind that we might not anticipate all the misunderstandings, but we can try to do so. Maybe ask ourselves a question. Would I be confused if someone showed me this graphic? So just trying to make sure that we're trying to anticipate the misunderstanding when possible. Being patient and giving students opportunities to process the information before we expect them to produce it. And also not being afraid to experiment. I think that I have tried so many different things throughout the years, and I understand which things have worked and which things have didn't, and I also enjoy learning from other teachers and seeing the ways that they incorporate the resources. It's important also that we understand that yes, there are a lot of challenges to making sure that the input is comprehensible. It takes a lot of time to plan the activities deliberately. Also, as teachers, we're all perfectionists, so we make sure that we have a high quality of materials. We want to make sure our visuals are clear. So they're clear challenges. However, I think it's important to keep in mind that the benefits outweigh the challenges. And the last tip, just make sure that you're having fun, because it is so important that we are having fun and enjoying ourselves with the students. And when the students see this passion, that translates into their passion for the language as well. So when we are delivering the language in the target language, what is the role of English? We should be using target language at 90% or more. However, there is that 10% that we might want to use depending on the situation. According to Helena Curtin, the use of English should be intentional and be a conscious decision, not just something the teacher slides into without thinking. The following series of questions can be helpful in deciding when and if using English instead of the target language is appropriate. Can I find a way to communicate the new idea in the new language with visuals or gestures? Can I simplify? Can I substitute a different concept? Can I delay this topic until we can deal with it in the target language? Could this be part of the lessons I leave for substitute teacher? Could this be a homework assignment using English language resources? Is an English explanation essential to further progress towards my goals for this lesson? I think that's very important to keep this checklist in mind. And hopefully that this will help you to make a determination on when the English language should be used. What about using English to clarify vocabulary? Again, here are the two questions that could be asked. Have I already tried using visuals, gestures, or other strategies to get the meaning across? Will failing to understand this vocabulary item interfere with the progress of the lesson? Of course. If after all these deliberations the teacher finally makes the decisions to use English for a specified purpose, it is still important to stay within the guidelines of target language, using 90 to 95 to 100% of the time when possible. And the last tip, just keep remembering that if understanding happens, don't give up. Readjust, reflect, and apply your knowledge to the next lesson. Hopefully now you can tell what comprehensible input and target language are, why comprehensible input and target language are important in a world language class, how to deliver effective comprehensible input in the target language, and how to apply strategies for comprehensible input and target language use in my classroom. Thank you so much.